Dr. Indri Assie-Lumumba has joined us, thank goodness. She's a professor of African and diaspora education, comparative and international education, social institutions, African social history, and the study of gender in the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University. From 96 to 97, she served as director of the Cornell Program on Gender and Global Change. She has been a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science since 2006. In 2010-11, she served as director of Graduate Studies of Africana Studies at Cornell University. She's also a member of 4 other Cornell graduate fields: education, international development, international agriculture and rural development, the Cornell Institute of Public Affairs. She is co-founder and associate director in charge of the gender unit of the Pan-African Studies and Research Center in International Relations and Education for Development. She's an author and editor of several books and has published numerous articles in referred journals. She's been an active member of many professional associations and has designed and or participated in as a resource person in numerous workshops and training programs for professionals in Africa. Professor Lumumba has worked and traveled to many countries in North-South America, the Caribbean, Asia, and Europe, and all throughout the African continent, where she is familiar with social context and is involved with institution building and human resource development. Most importantly, Dr. Lumumba is a member of the Voices of African Mothers Advisory Board. Yep.
Thank you so much and good afternoon. I'm glad I see familiar faces here and I'm going to make new connections. That's wonderful. And for all the work and the team are doing. I had a PowerPoint, but I thought I would have a conversation because that's an important. We need to have the facts, the statistics, the structures. But we need, more importantly, or in addition, in a complementary way, to have conversations about what's wrong and what is working, what ought to be done, what went wrong in the past, and how we can fix it. I hope I'll be able to cover some of the things on this little instrument here. I'm partly historian, and I was at the time when I started my college education, there was no women's studies around. But I was puzzled by something. I started in Côte d'Ivoire. I'm from Côte d'Ivoire, and then went on to France, and was studying in history and sociology. And I was puzzled by what I was reading in the European historical archives about African women. And what I had a sense that I understood. Nana and I, the European decided to draw a border between us. So she's on the English-speaking side, I'm on the French, but we are the same people. And so when I say I was puzzled by the role of women, that I thought I understood, and what I was reading is because we, on this side, the Ivorian side, we left what is Ghana today in the 18th century under the leadership of a woman, a queen, who didn't want to give up her power, but who refused to see her people fighting each other. Very empowering history that led me to do my master's thesis to understand gender relations in Africa, women. Of course, it's a continent. There are specificities in different regions, but what I find very fascinating is even in sub-regions where they say women are minor and so forth, when you scratch a little, you have a different understanding of the gender relations in the past. Many things have been done recently in the name of culture that have nothing to do with that culture that was inherited. Some of the aspects, and here I'm not going to say the European brought all the problems and no society has any perfection, and if anybody knows of a society that is harmonious and perfect, please let me know so I don't go there, because it's not real. Human societies have all their contradictions. So that's I need to say that. However, African societies had their system by which they went by. When some people declare that Africa didn't have any civilization, how did they manage throughout history? Without any civilization, without any education system, you bound to improvise constantly. You'll be disoriented all the time because you won't have any reference. So Africans had their reference. This is the reason why, like a small community, the entire continent rose against the European colonization. And women played a very powerful, significant role. And there are different social organizations in the African context. Social organizations that were built on the notion that the great scientists, historian, linguist, and everything else, Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal has termed at the complementarity. Many African scholars, Philomena Stidi, they have talked about this parallel autonomy, whereby society is considered a whole, and men and women play specific roles in a complementary way. Positive and empowering complementarity, because there are different forms of complementarity. The complementarity that creates hierarchy, saying, I will do this, but what I'm doing is of higher quality, higher value, and you do the other. You're complementing each other, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's a parallel or complementarity, where men and women decided which side, which part of society, how the education system would work, how the economy would work, what aspect they would play a part in, and what would be the social value. What you're doing is different, but of equal in its worth, in making society go on. So in terms of the formal education, non-formal education, men and women have their system, have their educational training. And this is where healthcare was very important. Women were caregivers. And as caregivers, they received their education accordingly. Women were producers in the economy. We didn't have this division of the public-private sphere, with a public sphere for men and private sphere for women. What women did in the private sphere was an extension of what they did outside in agricultural production. In the transatlantic enslavement, the first, for a long time, until the end of the so-called quotation mark slavery, African women were brought here. Of course, they endured all sorts of atrocities, but they were brought primarily here for their labor initially. Because in African societies, they didn't have this division where women were not important players outside. And the education was given in order to give them the proper preparation, the technical skills. And until today, you go anywhere in Africa, if you take out the what is called the cash crop economy, women are the ones who are still working. And that has been there for a long time. But then the education, the new education system that was set up, created a different form of gender division that had new value, that had new hierarchy. For instance, if there had been a consistency between the European system and the African women would have been trained primarily in agriculture, for example, because of the fundamental role they were playing. African women would have been trained in healthcare delivery. It's not what was done. On the contrary, the new system, not that it was great for the African men and boys, because it was part of the colonial system. It was to train them so that they could be useful. I'm saying all this because what is happening today is not separate from what happened back in the 20th century, early 20th century. And the African leadership inability to really rethink is part of the problem. That's why I'm giving this history, is not to blame the Europeans. So in French, for example, during the colonial era, when you were referring to a nurse, you could use the masculine term, infirmier, because all the healthcare assistants, since the Africans were not allowed to become medical doctors, the highest level of training was given to the men, not women. Many things changed. Sorry to use this maybe a little bit graphic, but women played a role in all the healthcare related to childbirth and so forth. They knew the basic scientific knowledge of the law of gravity. That's how delivery was done in a certain way, vertical position, because gravity helps. When the delivery table was introduced in Africa, that was a powerful signal that women were no longer part of the healthcare organization and delivery. So that has had a very important impact. In the case of the Francophone countries, all those who were trained to a relatively high level of the medical service were sent to Bamako. All those who were trained to become teachers were sent to Côte d'Ivoire. Those who were to be some kind of help in agriculture were sent to Katibugu, a town in Mali. No women among them. Even when the Africans themselves stopped fighting the European system and understood that formal education of great value in the changing society, there were no women around. So that displacement of African social institution, preparation for life, this is what we're seeing today. So that was the first phase of the displacement, disruption, and exclusion of those who gave the care from before birth to childbirth, to the early childhood, all the way to taking care of the elderly, the old parents, the women. They were excluded, literally, from the provision of technical skills, learning possibilities. So that was one stage. In some of the figures, graphs that I had prepared here, you can see even in the contemporary period, the distribution of male and female in the different fields of training at the post-secondary level. Have very few women in the medical field, in agronomy, in the areas where women are still playing a major role. The second major displacement was, regardless of how terrible a regime was at the time of independence, there were a few areas where all the leaders made a commitment. It's provision of free primary education, some secondary, building of universities, and healthcare services, free primary healthcare services. All this changed in the 1980s with the economic crisis, structural adjustment program. In another panel like this at Cornell University last semester, when I raised this issue, one of the panelists said, oh, structural adjustment was some time back, so it has no impact today. Well, it has an impact. It takes time to set up educational, medical infrastructure. So when you disrupt them, it takes time and resources to rebuild, to bring them to the level where they were when they were targeted for dismantling. So the 1980s and part of 1990 structural adjustment program decimated many of the social services. So when we're talking about the post-Beijing, at the time of the Beijing conference, many African countries were still barely struggling out of the impact of structural adjustment. On top of it, there are all these internal situations that led to conflict. Conflict is the worst enemy of advancement because there's no time to take care of the few resources, the few infrastructure. They are destroyed, they're not maintained, and again, it takes a long time to rebuild. So they are all the convergence of these external factors imposed different ways of training the African population, of educating boys and girls to become men and women, playing such a role in society, building of infrastructure, the global economic crisis and structural adjustment program, and the lack of vision of African leadership, some African leadership, and the destruction, self-destruction. Even if many of the factors are external, there have to be a response to those in order for it to act. Mrs. Dorothy Cotton, she is the person who was in charge of education during this civil rights struggle here, worked with the late Martin Luther King. She lives in Isaka. She wrote a book 2 years ago. It's called If Your Back Is Not Bent. It means that, well, people are riding on my back. If your back is not bent, people will not ride on it. African countries, they need to get their act together. They need to refocus. And so some of well, I don't, maybe my 15 minutes have passed. But the point I want to make is last summer I was in South Africa giving a talk on an effort that we made there to have a synergy of education and health. Some of the countries that have tried this have been the most successful. One example is Cuba. Cuba, you know the Cuban situation, the embargo and everything. It still has one of the best medical services because they have this convergence, synergy between healthcare, education, nutrition. These are some of the things that African countries will need to learn out of this tragedy. If anything at all, at least this tragedy should be an opportunity, if we can use this term, opportunity, for something so terrible, to promote new vision. There are a few other things that I wanted to say in terms of the new vision. Many African countries have now what they call the vision for the future, planning again. Rwanda 2020, Cote d'Ivoire 2035. When you analyze them, you see that there's no vision in it at all when it comes to gender relation. Because you look at the education system, the distribution of education, women or girls are, again, not intentionally, but it doesn't make any difference whether it is intentional or unintentional. So these are some of the issues that I want to raise. Maybe we can address them in the discussion. Again, I had prepared something more, but it would have taken time to go through each of these slides.